This is CG12, Foreign Policy. Describe the tools used to carry out United States foreign policy, including diplomacy and treaties, economic, military, and humanitarian aid, and sanctions and military intervention. The President's constitutional powers come chiefly from Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Article 2 grants the President the constitutional power to conduct diplomacy, to make war, to negotiate treaties, and to oversee the executive branch. It begins with the concept that all executive branch powers belong to the President, but some of these powers may be checked by the legislative and judicial branches of government. Also, presidents can receive additional powers delegated from Congress by legislation. Presidents possess explicit constitutional powers to conduct diplomacy and to negotiate treaties. However, the framers also gave the Senate power to check the president's actions. For example, the president appoints officials to conduct the official business of the United States, such as the Secretary of State and ambassadors to other countries. But the Senate may choose not to confirm these appointees or even vote on their appointments. Similarly, the President may negotiate a treaty, but the Senate must approve the treaty by a two-thirds majority for the treaty to become binding on the U.S. government. Let's take a look at the roles of the President. Commander-in-Chief, Chief Diplomat, Chief Bureaucrat, Chief Legislator, and Head of State and Government. The U.S. Constitution clearly vests power in the President to command the military. In part, the framers were well aware of the failures of Congress to effectively manage the military during and after the American Revolution. Financial self-interest and factional fights over patronage often overrode sound judgment in Congress. Congressional actions in supplying troops, appointing incompetent officers, and undermining military discipline resulted in lost troops and battles. In addition, problems existed when integrating state militia with the strategies and tactics of the Continental Army, and also with state government actions that harmed the fight for independence by acting at cross purposes to the national government. Similar problems existed in Congress effectively managing foreign policy during and after the American Revolution. For example, Congress appointed ambassadors from rival factions, regardless of competence, to France, where they fought amongst themselves for control of U.S. policy. Some appointees lacked language skills and cultural understanding, which harmed relations with our French allies. Goals for foreign policy by Congressional Committee were also contradictory, dilatory, subject to sudden changes, and lacking any coherent strategy. Congress also failed to enforce treaties that the U.S. signed and was unable to punish states that pursued their own foreign policies, resulting in disgrace for the Articles Congress. U.S. diplomacy became a byword for incompetence and unreliability amongst other nations. As a result, the framers intended to lodge the primary power to conduct foreign and military affairs in a unitary executive in order to render executive decisions speedily, effectively, discreetly, and with a single intention. Alexander Hamilton, in his Federalist Papers on the presidency, explained the commander-in-chief's role in number 74, the treaty-making role in number 75, and the role in appointing staff in numbers 76 and 77. Numbers 69 and 70 dealt with general comments about the presidency's powers. The Supremacy Clause and other provisions in the Constitution effectively grant the national government exclusive power over foreign policy and blocks state and local governments from exercising any powers in this area. The President is also placed at the head of state militias under Article 2 when Congress directs in cases of war or rebellion. The President commands the military and bureaucracy due to the separation of powers. Statutes by Congress must leave implementation to the executive branch and its officials. As the President serves as chief of government, the the executive branch officials must follow lawful orders from the President. With the dual role of head of state and head of government, the President also serves as the focal point of government for the average citizen. Even the most trivial of presidential actions receive daily coverage from the media, which grants the President leeway to muster public support for legislation and treaties, as well as diplomatic and military actions. Statutes, especially in foreign policy, have given broad grants of congressional power to the presidency to act with unity of purpose, and in a quick and decisive fashion. Over 200 years of such statutes grants the President many options to exercise power beyond their Article II ones. Wars and serious diplomatic crises spur presidential actions that often stretch the boundaries of constitutional and statutory provisions. Subsequently, presidents often claim support for their positions by citing past instances of similar presidential exercises of power in emergencies. However, it does lead some to fear the so-called imperial presidency, where presidential powers increasingly resemble those of King George III. There are numerous examples of presidential actions in foreign policy taken with and without congressional approval. Presidents have declared the nation neutral in foreign wars, claimed the power to recognize a country's government as legitimate, bought foreign territory, surreptitiously engaged in warfare, withdrawn unilaterally from treaties, sent troops to war under a UN treaty, and banned imports and immigration from other countries. Generally speaking, presidents exercise their broadest powers in foreign and military policy. Congress, as opposed to the President, possesses many specific enumerated powers to legislate on most military and foreign policy issues. They also have the power to remove a wayward president. Nevertheless, in foreign and military policy, Congress often reacts to what the President proposes or does. Intelligence and military use of force often involve the President simply informing Congress of what the President is doing or has already done. Most members of Congress lack the vast executive branch's information sources and find it difficult to determine whether the President's actions are warranted. The framers intended that Congress possess the power to legislate, but to not execute their own legislation. Previous grants of power by Congress to the President, plus the presidential veto power, has meant expansion of presidential authority over time. Seldom has presidential power been reduced by statute due to the President's veto power. Precedent also places Congress in a weaker position on foreign policy. Even the judiciary reluctantly supported presidential actions subsequently criticized, such as the World War II internment of Japanese American citizens. On occasion, Congress tries to prevent presidents from having a totally free hand in military and foreign policy. One such act, passed over presidential veto, is the War Powers Act, which attempts to define when the military may be used and for how long without congressional approval. This law was passed after the costly Vietnam conflict, where no war was declared, but the U.S. suffered massive casualties and economic cost. More often, the Senate usually balks at ratifying treaties that are unpopular with the American people, with many not even coming to a vote. Sometimes the Senate has attached reservations on treaties that restrict how a treaty will be interpreted. Also, the Senate does reject presidential nominees quite often. Congress often requires presidents to certify certain conditions exist in order to trigger presidential use of certain powers. Specialized courts and detailed legislation serve to involve the judiciary in interpretation of presidential powers as well. Statutory limitations allow federal judiciary to restrain presidential actions that appear to violate federal law. In 2005, John Bolton was nominated for U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations by President Bush. However, despite the fact the Republicans controlled the U.S. Senate, There were not sufficient votes to confirm Bolton in order to overcome a Senate filibuster on his nomination. Opposing senators claimed that Bolton was not suited by temperament to work at the United Nations. Despite being renominated and serving in a recess appointment, the Senate failed again to confirm his appointment in 2006. President Bush had to nominate someone else. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I, but had provisions for a new international peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. Against President Wilson's wishes, the Senate majority, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, attached reservations to the treaty, which required Congress to approve any subsequent action under the treaty. President Wilson ultimately failed to garner enough political support to force the Senate to approve the Treaty of Versailles without reservations. As a result, the treaty was not ratified. A major tool for U.S. diplomacy is the ability of the United States to offer aid to other nations. The United States has spent billions of U.S. dollars to provide economic, military, and humanitarian aid every year to other countries. Some of this aid is given to international organizations such as the World Bank, United Nations, the Camp David Agreements, or NATO. Other aid is given directly to other countries from the United States. Over $50 billion from the United States is proposed to be spent on foreign aid in fiscal year 2017. While the President can propose spending on foreign aid, the House and Senate must approve allocating the funds before they may be spent. Sanctions usually come from the President under existing laws and treaties, but sometimes take place through specific laws passed by Congress. Those punishments for a country allow the President to ban certain individuals or nationalities from entering the country, punish corporations from doing business with banned countries, and limit trade with countries, etc. The U.S. also enforces and honors international sanctions passed by such bodies as the United Nations and its subsidiaries. For violations of international law and treaties, the U.S. and international organizations have placed a number of sanctions against the North Korean government, and even upon specific individuals in that government. These include limiting trade by U.S. corporations or individuals to humanitarian items, stopping and seizing shipments of nuclear material sent to other countries, forbidding certain North Koreans involved in terrorism from entering the United States, and preventing North Korea from accessing the international banking system due to its financing terrorism in other countries. The President's constitutional powers as Commander-in-Chief place the President as the sole commander of U.S. military forces. However, the power to declare war rests with the U.S. Congress as well as the spending power to enable any spending on military interventions. In addition, statutes and treaties also govern how the President may use or forbid the use of the military to reach U.S. foreign policy goals. The U.S. has formally declared wars 5 times in its history, with the last being World War II in 1941. Other armed conflicts have been fought under congressional resolutions, such as the Gulf War I and II, or even presidential orders in the Korean conflict. The U.S. has undertaken military action frequently to protect and evacuate U.S. citizens and others from war zones, civil wars, or areas of natural disaster. Additionally, the U.S. military has fought pirates since the U.S. Navy was created in the 1790s until today. U.S. military forces likewise have been engaged in a global war against terrorists that threaten the U.S. or other countries with their actions. Frequently, other nations request military training and assistance from the United States in order to protect their citizens from war and terrorism. The United States has also signed mutual defense treaties which require the U.S. to act in support of our nation's allies during military conflict. The most famous of these is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which links European countries with the U.S. in a mutual self-defense pact. Currently, the United States and other countries have defined as a terrorist organization the group calling itself ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, due to multiple atrocities and terroristic actions throughout the Middle East and the world. To combat ISIS, the military is engaged in multinational airstrikes, provided military assistance to Iraq, including training, intelligence, and weaponry, provided intelligence to other countries fighting terrorism by ISIS, and fighting ISIS and its allies through covert and overt military actions throughout the world. The President has preeminence in foreign affairs and military action in the U.S. Constitution because the framers wished to remedy faults in the Articles of Confederation. Nevertheless, the framers placed checks on presidential actions by allowing Congress to make the laws regarding military and foreign policy, approve treaties, approve presidential appointees, declare war, and the power to approve or deny funding for a president's foreign and military policy actions. Separation in powers is designed to prevent unchecked presidential power, but still allows the president to immediately address critical national security and diplomatic goals of the U.S. with speed and with a unified diplomatic voice to other countries. Sources for images. Sources for images, page 2. Sources for images, page 3. Sources for this content module. Additional resources for this content module. This concludes this content module.